Okay, welcome back. We're on Chapter 4, page 121. So this one is about risk management. So here are the learning objectives. Basically, explain the frameworks and the components involved. Risk appetite and how it relates to residual risk, how it's documented, how do you determine the likelihood, like in a percent, you know, and then there's risk strategies that you can do. So the opening case, kind of interesting. Please take a minute to read it. Everyone's invited. Legal requirements, identify and classify risks. Okay, cool. So introduction, page 122. They talk about security governance. I have a tough time saying that word. Requires effective risk management. Basically, I need to be able to convey to like the people at the top, just how vulnerable we are and what is the consequences if we get broken into. In the early days, it was basically like a competitive advantage. Think like stock market analysis. Whoever had the greatest technology was going to do the best, kind of a thing. And then stock market, I'm going to employ this type of algorithm to reduce my risk, that kind of stuff. But now everyone's like using AI and stuff like that to be able to reduce risk. So right now, it's not so much as trying to get up on top. It's to not fall behind. Okay, so instead of competitive advantage, it's the avoidance of competitive disadvantage. Kind of crazy. Anyway, don't want to fall behind. Also, don't want to move too fast. So it's kind of a slippery slope kind of a thing, right? Okay, so what's the overall goal of risk management? Is the goal to eliminate risk? No, it's to manage risk, to understand it and to take care of it as much as you can. But you're never going to eliminate risk. That's just not practical. So, just as an example, could we build a car that eliminated basically all of the risk of driving to work in the morning? Could we do that? Could we build a car like that? Yeah, we probably could. It would probably look like one of these. Yeah, driving down the road at the highway speeds and stuff. Could you have basically a risk-free vehicle? Yeah, you could. Okay. The problem is no one's going to buy it. It's going to be too heavy, too expensive, right? So it's not a matter of can we do it. It's just I don't wanna. All right. So here's the thing. Most people driving to work is probably the most risky thing they do in their entire life is getting in a car and going to work and coming home. Does that mean we don't go to work? Well, of course not. We just accept that risk, right? Now we might take some, go slow and maybe we have an SUV rather than a little tiny car, or, maybe we're wearing our seatbelt and, there's lots of things you can do to mitigate it, but we're not eliminating risk. Okay. We accept risk. Okay. So the art of risk management, page 122. And so now we're back to the same old with the CIA triad. This is the same thing we saw from chapter 1. All the goals are interrelated. That's why it's in the shape of a triangle. And one more time, the art of war. We've talked about this before. Know yourself. Identify and examine the systems that you have. And you have to know the strengths and weaknesses of everything you have, because you can't protect what you don't know about. And then know your enemy. Again, identify and examine threats. Which threat is the most important? Which one would cause the most monetary, loss or disruption? Again, so we're kind of thinking this back to the CEO kind of thinking about business needs first. I'm not going to spend $5 on a lock to protect a $1 item, right? Okay, so you got to make sure all this is all. So let me ask you another question. So, do you think you're going to have in your budget all the money you need to be able to perform all the protection that you think that you deserve? That's just not real. No. So you're going to have to prioritize what you do and then ask for more money. And you got to have a convincing argument. You're basically going to have a business plan. Okay, here's what's going to happen, and here's why we're doing it, and here's how much money we're going to save or prevent loss or something. Okay. So risk management framework, page 123. So basically, where is the risk? Okay. How severe is it? What is the level of acceptable risk? Now, this could vary from department to department. Maybe for example, in the manufacturing part, risk is about, does a machine fail? But in marketing, it could be some other company is taking over our territory. The risks are completely different. And even person to person, you might get a brand new CEO who is, the term is risk averse. Like, oh, I'll take a lot of risk. And the next one comes in and says, no, I don't want to take hardly any risk. So it's kind of an interesting concept that things like that could change. And then, of course, you have to treat it. So identification, analysis, evaluation, and treatment. Okay. So on page 124, they talk about, the risk management framework. This is mainly stuff like from the system development lifecycle, the SDLC. So again, it starts with governance, and then, you start with a framework, and then you implement, and then you check to see if it works. And then if it doesn't work, you make a tweak to it, right? It's always a circle, because you put something in place, but, due diligence says, I'm going to have to monitor to make sure it's working. And if there's anything in there that's not working, I'm going to have to go back over it again. So it's basically the same concept, but here's the process. Again, some sort of preparation, identification, analysis, evaluation, and then the risk treatment, and then you have to go back through over a second time. Okay. And so this is kind of sort of like developed and reviewed by management to make sure everything is honky-dory. The roles of community of interest, page 124. So there's an awful lot of stuff out there. For example, one of the key things I keep talking about is, particularly with, know yourself, you can't have a hidden machine someplace. You need to have something that has all of your computers, all the servers, all that stuff. Some sort of an asset inventory. And it would make sense to have this in a database, right? If you have a big company. So I'm going to demo some software that could allow you to do that. Okay, so this is a piece of software called Son of Snoop on Steroids. Crazy name, SOSOS. And I'm just going to hit the button here to collect. Now, I'm on a virtual machine, so there's not going to be that much stuff in here. But nevertheless, we're going to go through it all. So it's going to collect all this stuff and optionally save this into a database. Now, you can have this configured so that it runs on every machine, or you could have it, run across the, you can poll the network, by Active Directory or an IPLS or domain, and it'll go out and hit all the machines in your network and collect all this data. Or you can set it up for a login batch file, so every time they log into the system, it records all this stuff. So this is tons and tons and tons of information about, everything in the world. For example, with the one called QFE, I'm going to change the view. This basically talks about the patches. So if you had this in a database, you could sit there at your office and say, show me all the machines that are missing KB5066128. And boop, they'll just pop up on the screen. Then you go find them and figure out how come the automatic patching routine didn't work. Okay, so you need an asset inventory. You need to have something that talks about how things are configured and what software is installed and all that stuff. Because this has everything. All the software that's installed on the system, everything. All the version numbers, BIOS needs updating, everything. Okay, so the IT community, build secure systems and operate them safely, right? Consider a backup strategy as part of this plan. The user community. So we start with management, what they can do, and then the IT community. This considered, like an IT tool, right? And then the user community, where you must know their roles and asset inventories are most, which ones are most important, things of that nature. And then periodic reviews, because once again, you can't just go around doing things once. Inventory, controls, mitigation strategies. Due diligence requires that you know that things are working. I will tell you, I've told you this story once, but I'll tell you too again. We had a system that produced, printed reports on demand, and I would go do, a dumpster dive, and I would find printed reports in the trash that had social security numbers and names. And so I would, beat them on the head and say, quit doing this, quit doing this. And finally I got to the point where it was a losing battle. I couldn't do it fast enough. So I altered the system so when you printed the report, it never printed the Social Security numbers. Okay. So yeah, I need to verify that what I tell them to do actually works. Because me beating them on the head saying, don't do that, is not sufficient. I have to circle back around and prove that it was effective. Okay. Risk management policy on page 125. It's very similar to the enterprise, information security thing. You have a purpose and an objective and roles and responsibilities and resources, except this time you have a section on risk appetite and tolerances. Again, some organizations inside your company are going to be very risk averse. Others, not quite so much. Guidelines and special instructions. So on page 126, they talk about, the framework design. I could use an existing one as a starting point, or I can build my own. It's not that complicated. Just save you a little bit of work. So let's talk about this risk appetite part. So I'm drafting up this, risk management plan. But I haven't really stopped and talked to too many people. This is kind of like, maybe it's a bottom-up approach, where an IT professional is doing it. So you can't really pick the risk strategy at this point in development of the document. You're going to have to go do some other stuff and then circle back around and say, okay, this department has this department, or this person has this. Okay. So basically it's a draft risk management plan that you bring around. So let's talk about risk management and tolerances, page 126. So risk appetite is how much can you live with? So a high risk appetite, does that mean I can accept more risk or less risk? How's that word work? Risk appetite? Okay. So obviously this could be very different among people and organizations. So what kind of business would have a low risk appetite? Okay, let's start over. Which one would have a high risk appetite? Like speculative trading on the stock market. Darn well that 40% of the stuff you do is going to end in failure, but the 60% is going to make up for it. So it's okay if things don't work. So their mindset is, I'm okay. If things don't work, I'm okay. And that same mindset might bleed over to, we need to spend $10,000 to secure the system. And they go, no, I'm okay. I'm not going to spend $10,000. That could bleed through. On the other hand, if you're a bank, no, I'm going to have a very, very low tolerance to risk, because I don't want anybody breaking in and stealing money, right? That would be really, really bad. So just kind of different organizations. Okay. And then residual risk is after you've done everything, all the controls are in place and all the management stuff and all the training, there's got to be some residual risk. And then you basically have to say, is this important? Now, here's the thing. If, let's say I'm getting ready to launch a rocket into space and I come up with all the risks that could happen, and I'm never going to eliminate all the risk. The thing could blow up. But I'm going to document all the residual risk. And the purpose for that is, if something goes wrong and they come back and say, why didn't you think of this? You could say, I did think about it. Okay? It's right here. I just mathematically determined the likelihood was not worth it. So yeah, that's kind of sort of important that you record the residual risk. Don't just say, well, the residual risk is residual, so I don't have to deal with it. No. Yeah, you're right. You're not going to do anything, but you're going to document it. So if somebody comes back around and says, well, you were negligent because you didn't consider this, it's like, oh, yes, I did. All right. So risk tolerance, risk threshold, the range of acceptable risk, perhaps zero. It is possible you could have an organization that had I'm sorry, I can't afford any risk whatsoever. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. You guys know how this works.